Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we tell the complete story of Gazlowe, the goblin engineer who built a city out of sand and stubbornness, stood beside Thrall when the new Horde was nothing but a dream, and eventually became the trade prince who tried to change what it meant to be a goblin in the first place. There is a type of person that every age produces in every civilization whose value only becomes apparent in retrospect. They are not the heroes. They are not the villains. They are not the prophets or the chosen ones or the bearers of legendary weapons. They are the ones who show up when the plan fails and ask a practical question. Well, what do we actually need right now? And then they build it. Gazlowe is that person. He is short, green, loud, and relentlessly competent. He tells jokes at inopportune moments and charges fair prices for his work. He has survived every catastrophe that Azeroth has thrown at him. The founding of a new nation, a volcanic eruption that destroyed his people's homeland, a war that cracked the world open, a siege of the Horde's own capital, a demon invasion across two worlds, and a political system so comprehensively broken that fixing it required someone willing to look like an idiot in front of his peers for a few years. He has survived all of it by being useful, by being honest, and by having the good sense to know the difference between a project he can finish and one that will kill him. He is also, genuinely, one of the most decent people in the Horde's history. Not perfect, not without self-interest. He is a goblin, and self-interest is practically a biological function. But decent in a way that is harder and rarer than it sounds in a world that turns people into instruments of war or ambition on a fairly regular basis. This is his story, but to understand it, you have to understand what he was born into and what he chose to leave behind. Goblin civilization is old in ways that most of Azeroth does not appreciate. The goblins have been around since the age of the Titans. Their intelligence is actually the result of Titan-crafted mineral compounds, the same Azerite-adjacent substances that catalyzed cognitive development in multiple species across the world. In the goblins' case, the substance was called kaja'mite, a mineral found in abundance in the volcanic rock of Mount Kajaro on the Isle of Kazan. The trolls who originally inhabited Kazan forced the goblins to mine it, and sustained exposure to kaja'mite unlocked in the goblins something the trolls had not anticipated, an explosion of intellectual capacity that made the goblins dramatically more clever than any of their overseers expected. Kazan, in those early days, was a place of two worlds existing in the same geography. Above ground, the Zandalari and Gurubashi troll factions maintained their dominance, building their temples and conducting their trade in the volcanic highlands. Below ground, goblins crawled through tunnel systems that went deeper with each passing generation, following the kaja'mite seams into the mountain's hot interior. The work was dangerous. Tunnel collapses, gas pockets, floods from underground water sources. All of these were constants in the mining life. The goblins lost people every generation to the mountain's hunger, and yet the mineral they extracted from its rock rewired them, generation by generation, into something the trolls had never intended to create. The cognitive changes from kaja'mite exposure were not subtle. They were not the slow accumulation of marginal improvements over millennia. They were fast, measurable, undeniable. Goblins who worked the deep seams came back to the surface different. They saw patterns in things that had previously appeared random. They made connections between problems and solutions that nobody had taught them to make. They invented, they built. They looked at the structures the trolls had built, grand, imposing, architecturally sophisticated, and began to understand not just what they were, but how they were made and what made them stand and what would make them fall. The trolls noticed. Of course they noticed. Overseers are always alert to changes in the behavior of the overseen, because any change in behavior is a potential threat to control. But they did not fully appreciate what they were watching until it was too late to reverse it. The goblins used that intelligence to do what intelligent beings do when they are being exploited. They got out. Through accumulation of leverage, through careful application of new technical knowledge, through the invention of explosive compounds that made continued enslavement more trouble than it was worth, the goblins freed themselves from troll dominance. They kept the island. They kept the mine. They built a civilization around kaja'mite and the technology it enabled. The liberation of the goblins from troll domination was not a single dramatic revolution. It was decades of gradual, incremental subversion. The goblins began by making themselves indispensable. They offered their engineering skills to the trolls who controlled them, accepting worse terms than free workers would have demanded, positioning themselves as specialists whose expertise the troll economy depended on. They got inside the infrastructure. They built the aqueducts and the granary systems and the road networks. They understood those systems in a depth that their overseers did not. And then, when the moment was right, when the leverage was sufficient and the compounds were ready, they demonstrated what happens when the people who build your civilization decide they no longer want to be owned. The trolls did not reclaim Kazan. The goblins had made it impossible. The civilization they built in the wake of that liberation was called the Trade Empires, and it was organized around the cartel system. A cartel in goblin terms is not quite what the word implies. In other contexts, it is closer to a corporation with the ambitions of a small government and the accountability of neither. Each major cartel is controlled by a trade prince who holds power through accumulated wealth, leverage over subordinates, and the willingness to do whatever the economic situation demands. Loyalty is purchased. Allegiance follows profit. Every relationship in goblin society is, at its foundation, transactional. Undermine is the capital of this civilization, and it is extraordinary. Built into the volcanic rock beneath Mount Kaja'mite, it is a subterranean city of enormous scale and density, a maze of tunnels and caverns that the goblins have, over centuries, expanded and decorated and reinforced into something that functions less like a mine and more like a metropolis. The markets of Undermine are legendary across every continent. Every good produced anywhere in the world finds its way to Undermine eventually, filtered through the cartel system's commercial networks. Exotic materials from every climate, weapons of every tradition, devices mechanical and magical, and sometimes both at once, substances legal and otherwise in various jurisdictions. Undermine's vendors will offer you all of it, at prices negotiated by people who have been haggling since before they could walk. The architecture of Undermine reflects its origins and its character. Nothing in it is built for aesthetics. Every structure serves a function, and the function is usually commercial. Warehouses the size of small districts, trading floors where dozens of deals are conducted simultaneously in a noise level that would constitute a moderate emergency in any other city. Banking institutions, whose vaults descend deeper into the rock than most of the mining tunnels. The cartel headquarters, buildings that are simultaneously administrative centers, fortresses, and the public face of each cartel's brand, are the closest thing to architectural ambition that Undermine produces, and even these are primarily designed to convey power rather than beauty. The population of Undermine is stratified in a way that would be familiar to any student of extreme commercial civilizations. At the very top, the trade princes and their immediate families, whose wealth is genuinely obscene, accumulated over generations of the kind of commercial exploitation that the cartel system enables, compounded by the advantages of being at the top of an institution designed to concentrate wealth upward. Below them, a layer of executives and senior managers and major shareholders who benefit from the system substantially, if not as dramatically. Then the middle strata of merchants and engineers and skilled workers who make a living, sometimes a comfortable one, but who are always one bad contract away from a much worse situation. And at the bottom, the vast majority of Undermine's actual population, the workers, the laborers, the cleaners and carriers, and maintainers and builders, and all the other people whose daily effort keeps the whole machine running, and who see very little of what that effort produces in terms of their own material circumstances. This produces a civilization that is simultaneously highly productive and comprehensively exploitative. Goblin technology is genuinely extraordinary. The engineering traditions developed in Kazan are among the most sophisticated in the world. Goblin ships, goblin explosives, goblin mechanical devices of every description are in demand across every continent. The trade empires accumulated enormous wealth precisely because they were good at making things other people wanted. What the system does not produce is fairness. In Undermine, the capital city, buried in the volcanic rock beneath Mount Kaja'ro, power flows relentlessly upward toward whoever holds the most coin. People at the bottom of the hierarchy get ground down. What they earn gets taken. What they build gets claimed by whoever has the leverage to claim it. The city is a machine for concentrating wealth at the top, and everyone who lives in it understands this, and most of them accept it, because that is simply how goblin civilization works. The acceptance is not passive, exactly. Goblins who live in Undermine understand the system and work to advance within it on its own terms. The ambition to move up is universal. Every goblin in Undermine who is working at the bottom is running some side scheme, some additional commercial operation, some investment or speculation or side contract that they hope will lift them into the next tier. The system generates this behavior intentionally. The dream of advancement is the mechanism that makes people accept conditions they would otherwise find intolerable. Most of the time, the dream does not come true. The cartel system is designed to produce a very few winners and a very large number of people who almost won. The people who almost won work as hard as, and sometimes harder than the people who did win, which is the entire point. Gazlowe did not accept it. He grew up in Undermine. He watched how the system operated. He saw how every clever invention he made ended up benefiting someone with more leverage than him, how every deal that seemed fair turned out to have fine print he had not read carefully enough. how every relationship in the city was ultimately about extraction rather than collaboration. He attended the Undermine Commerce College, a prestigious institution by goblin standards, which means it was expensive, competitive, and primarily designed to produce people who were skilled at the extractive end of the transactional system rather than the productive end. The Undermine Commerce College occupies several levels of what would be premium real estate in any surface city. Its curriculum covers commercial law, negotiation tactics, contract construction, basic engineering, applied economics, and a range of specialized courses depending on which cartel happens to be sponsoring the particular semester. The education it provides is, in its way, genuinely excellent. It teaches goblins how commerce works, how leverage is accumulated and deployed, how to read a contract and identify the clause that will end you, how to write a contract that will end someone else first. It is a curriculum designed by and for people who understand that knowledge is power and that the cartel system is the water they all swim in. What it does not teach, what it cannot teach, given its institutional orientation, is how to build something that serves a purpose beyond extracting value from whoever uses it. The distinction between building a business and building an institution, between creating commercial value and creating something that makes a community work better, is not a distinction that the Undermine Commerce College was designed to illuminate. At the college, he met Marin Noggenfogger, who would become one of his oldest friends. They were roommates. Marin had a different way of engaging with goblin society. He was charming, commercially minded in a more conventional way, and would go on to build his own reputation in places far from Undermine's underground corridors. But in those early years, they were two young goblins trying to figure out what they were going to do with the intelligence and the ambition they had been given in a system that seemed designed to convert both into someone else's profit. Gazlowe was, from the beginning, an anomalous student. He excelled at the engineering curriculum, the mechanics of structures and devices, the application of forces and materials to practical problems, with a facility that his instructors found gratifying and slightly irritating in equal measure. He was less distinguished in the commercial curriculum, not because he could not learn it. He understood commercial law and contract construction perfectly well. The problem was that he kept asking questions about what the contract was for, what purpose it served, what value it created, whether it actually needed all the clauses that transferred liability to whoever was least positioned to bear it. These are not questions that Undermine Commerce College instructors tend to encounter, and they do not always react well to them. He graduated. He was good enough at what the college taught that his record was creditable even with the awkward questions about commercial ethics built in. He came out of the institution with his engineering skills refined, his commercial knowledge adequate to navigate the world, and his view of Undermine's system confirmed in the most direct way possible by watching it operate at close range for several years. Gazlowe made a decision. He would leave Undermine, and he would never come back. He was not wrong about what he was leaving, but he did not know yet what he was leaving for. He joined the Steamweedle Cartel, one of the largest and most established of the goblin trading organizations, known for their network of neutral port towns scattered across multiple continents. The Steamweedle Cartel's business model was built on neutrality. They sold to everyone, bought from everyone, maintained safe harbors that any faction could use, and profited from the flow of trade regardless of which side was winning whatever war was currently happening. It was, in its way, a more honest version of goblin capitalism than what Undermine represented. The steam wheedle made their money by providing genuine services rather than by grinding down people with less leverage. The cartel had been building its network of neutral ports for generations before Gazlowe arrived. Booty Bay, clinging to the cliffs of Stranglethorn Vale, was the original template, a port that pirates and merchants and treasure hunters all used because it was genuinely neutral and genuinely safe, governed by goblin rules that applied equally to everyone and enforced by the kind of firm commercial pragmatism that made clear rule breaking was bad for business. Gadgetsan in Tanaris was another node in the network, a desert trading post that served as the commercial hub for the excavation and salvage operations that the Tanaris region supported. Everlook in Winterspring, Steam Wheedle Port in Tanaris, smaller and more specialized. These were the reference points for what Gazlowe was being asked to build. The Steam Wheedle model was proven. The question was whether he could apply it to a new location, a stretch of Kalimdor's eastern coast in a region called the Barrens, with the resources and timeline the cartel was offering. He could. He said so, named his price, and got on a ship. Gazlowe's engineering skills made him valuable to the cartel. He was good, genuinely extraordinarily good, at building things that worked under adverse conditions. He could look at a problem and see the solution in terms of components and mechanisms. He could take what was available, whatever materials a location happened to have in abundance, whatever tools a crew happened to own, whatever structural features the terrain offered, and turn it into something functional. This is rarer and more valuable than it sounds. Most engineers can build from plans. Gazlowe could build from circumstances. The cartel sent him west, to Kalimdor, to a stretch of coast along the Barrens that had nothing going for it except a decent natural harbor and the fact that nobody else had claimed it yet. He looked at the patch of sand and rocky coastline. He looked at the scrubby, sparse vegetation of the surrounding barrens. He looked at the harbor, and he started building. Ratchet did not look like much in the beginning. The first structure was a simple dock, 2 piers extending into the harbor, wide enough for a medium merchant vessel to tie up alongside, built from timber hauled overland from the forest margins to the northwest. The timber was not ideal. The transportation was expensive. The first dock required 3 redesigns before the tidal variations were properly accounted for and the pilings had enough depth to resist the seasonal storms that came off the ocean. Gazlowe learned the Barrens coast through the process of building in it. The winds came from the southwest in the late afternoon, which affected which direction the dock extensions should face to minimize stress on the pilings. The soil directly beneath the beach sand was a compressed clay layer that provided excellent foundation material at about 4 feet depth, better than anything he had encountered in Undermine's volcanic rock. The local stone, which he had initially dismissed as too porous for load-bearing construction, turned out to be workable for walls if it was reinforced with a lime mortar he developed from materials available locally. The settlement that Gazlowe constructed in that location became Ratchet, the neutral port town that would serve for decades as the economic hub of the eastern Barrens, the point of connection between the Horde territories to the west and south and the Alliance routes to the north, a place where anyone could dock and trade and conduct business without worrying about getting attacked on the basis of faction allegiance. It was, from a civic engineering standpoint, a triumph. Docks sufficient for significant maritime traffic, warehouses adequate to store serious quantities of goods, market facilities for merchants of multiple species to conduct business, and the basic infrastructure of a functioning town: roads, basic sanitation, water access, in an environment that had none of those things when Gazlowe arrived. It was also the place where Gazlowe would find his purpose, though he did not know it yet when the first buildings were going up. The construction of Ratchet was not a single dramatic event. It was years of gradual development, of adding buildings as the traffic justified them, of solving problems as they arose, rather than planning for every contingency in advance. Gazlowe ran it the way he ran everything, practically, with attention to what was actually needed rather than what looked impressive, and with a willingness to do the unglamorous work himself if that was what it took. He supervised, he designed, he got his hands dirty. He argued with suppliers and charmed customers, and drove hard bargains, and generally conducted himself like a goblin who had not forgotten where he came from, but had decided to do something different with what he knew. The workforce that built Ratchet was a mix of hired goblin workers and local labor. The Barrens had a population of Horde-adjacent peoples who were willing to work for fair pay, and Gazlowe paid fair pay. This was not a purely principled decision. It was also a practical one. Workers who are paid fairly finish their work. Workers who are cheated find ways to slow the project down. A remote location where replacing a key crew member required sending a ship and waiting weeks for the replacement to arrive. Having workers who wanted to be there was a genuine operational advantage. He had a simple rule about Ratchet. It was neutral, it was fair, and everyone was welcome as long as they did not start trouble. This was the steam wheedle model, but Gazlowe made it his own. Ratchet, under his management, was genuinely neutral, not the aggressive transactional neutrality of an institution that will sell to either side because it does not care who wins, but the deliberate principled neutrality of a town that understood that its value lay in being safe for everyone and therefore could not afford to be dangerous for anyone. The Steamweedle Cartel's relationship with Ratchet was straightforward. They owned the franchise, so to speak, the branding and commercial network and political cover that made it possible to maintain neutrality even when the surrounding region was contested. But Gazlowe ran the town, and his running of it was what made it what it was. The Steamweedle connection provided the infrastructure for neutrality. Gazlowe's personal philosophy made it real. This made him, by the standards of goblin culture, somewhat unusual. Goblins are not known for principled neutrality. They are known for profitable neutrality, which is a different thing. The Barrens that Ratchet sat on the edge of was, in those years before the world changed, one of the most contested and complicated regions on Kalimdor. It was an enormous expanse of dry grassland and scrub, hot in the day and cold at night, cut through by the dry South Fork River in its upper reaches and the lush water oasis in the middle, and transitioning into the swampy terrain of Dust Wallow Marsh in the south. The crossroads, roughly at the geographic center of the region, was the Horde's main interior waypoint, a cluster of buildings at the intersection of the main north-south and east-west roads through the Barrens, perpetually busy, perpetually targeted by Alliance raiding parties who regarded disrupting Horde commerce as a legitimate military objective. Wailing Caverns lay to the northwest, a network of cave systems where druids had gone mad and the vegetation had grown into something threatening and enormous. The ancient Kaldori ruins along the coastal ridges to the west held remnants of a civilization that predated the Sundering by 10,000 years. Quilboar, pig-faced humanoids whose spiritual traditions centered on the demigod Agamagan, had claimed the Central Barrens as their territory and contested it with the Horde settlements at every opportunity. The Razormane and Bristleback Quilboar tribes were constant pressures on Horde operations throughout the region. Into all of this, Ratchet sat on the eastern coast and was conspicuously, deliberately, purposefully none of anyone's business. Horde patrols from the crossroads did not enter Ratchet to enforce Horde authority. Alliance ships that stopped at Ratchet's docks were not attacked by Horde military forces. Quilboar raiding parties that swept the surrounding Barrens stopped at the edge of Ratchet's perimeter, not because of any particular agreement, but because Ratchet was neutral territory, and attacking neutral territory had costs that even the Quilboar had eventually calculated were not worth paying. Gazlowe maintained this neutrality through a combination of consistent behavior and frank commercial communication. When Horde military commanders came to ask whether Alliance vessels had recently put in and what they had been carrying, he was polite and unhelpful. When Alliance merchants came to him with concerns about Horde commercial competition, he was equally polite and equally unhelpful. When anyone arrived with the intention of turning Ratchet into a base of operations for their particular side in whatever conflict was currently running, he told them, in so many words, what they could do with that idea and what it would cost if they needed him to be more specific. He also built relationships with the merchants who came through regularly, with the captains who depended on Ratchet as a reliable waypoint on the Kalimdor coast, with the Horde communities of the Barrens interior who used Ratchet as their primary access point to maritime trade. These relationships were commercial in their framing, but they were also genuinely friendly. Gazlowe remembered names. He remembered what people had purchased on previous visits and what they were usually looking for. He asked after families and business situations and the progress of projects he had heard about previously. He was, in the most natural and unperformative way, a good host. The town grew. More merchants meant more goods, which meant more need for warehousing, which meant more warehouse construction, which employed more workers, which created more demand for goods and services locally, which attracted more merchants. The commercial ecology of a port town has its own logic, and Ratchet's commercial ecology was healthy from early on because the foundation was solid, honest dealing, reliable neutrality, and an operator whose word was known to be good. The Steamweedle Cartel understood what they had in Gazlowe. They left him alone, which was the most valuable thing they could do. They collected their share of Ratchet's commercial output, which was appropriate and agreed upon, and they did not attempt to extract additional value by interfering in how he ran the town. This restraint was partly commercial wisdom. A port that worked was worth more than a port that was constantly being adjusted from above, and partly a reflection of the fact that Gazlowe's terms with the cartel had been drawn up carefully, and he had included provisions for operational independence. He was, even in those early years, very good at contracts. The Third War came to Kalimdor and changed everything, as it changed everything everywhere. Gazlowe was in Ratchet when the Orcish refugees came ashore. The Horde, what remained of it after the catastrophes of the Second War and the internment camps, had followed the Prophet Medivh's guidance across the sea, landing on the coast of Kalimdor under the leadership of Thrall. They were not an invading army in the traditional sense. They were a people trying to find a new home, carrying the weight of everything that had gone wrong in the last decade, carrying a vision of what they might be if they could get free of the demon's corruption and the humans' prisons and build something new. The orcs who had survived the Second War and the internment camps were a people who had been through the worst that one civilization could do to another. The demonic blood that Gul'dan had given them, that had powered the first Horde's destructive march through the eastern kingdoms, had left a legacy of lethargy and shame, a hangover of corruption that had sapped their will and made them easy targets for the internment. The camps had been traumatic in their own right, years of confinement, of watching their children grow up as prisoners, of knowing that the fire of Orcish culture was being slowly extinguished by captivity. Thrall's liberation of those camps was not just a military operation. It was the act that made the new Horde possible. But liberating people from a prison and giving them a new home are two different projects, and the second is harder. The Horde that landed on Kalimdor had warriors and shamans and families and the tools they had managed to carry, and not much else. They needed everything that a community needs: shelter, food, water access, defense. They needed it in a harsh environment, the Barrens and the territory immediately north of it, which would become Durotar, were not hospitable. The land was dry, the soil was thin, and the local wildlife had the sort of disposition that suggested it had not been asked whether it wanted neighbors. Thrall needed a city. More accurately, he needed someone who could build a city in an environment that was hostile to construction, with resources that were not yet organized into anything resembling a supply chain, on a timeline that was driven not by comfort, but by necessity. He came to Gazlowe's. The Warcraft 3 campaign, specifically the Orc campaign in the Reign of Chaos chapter, places Gazlowe in a direct working relationship with Thrall from the earliest stages of the Horde's settlement of Durotar. He appears across multiple missions, most significantly in the city-building scenarios that represent the early construction of Horde infrastructure in the new land. In game terms, this is represented through the base-building mechanics of the real-time strategy format: peons harvesting lumber and gold, barracks going up, towers placed at the perimeter. What it represents narratively is something worth sitting with. Gazlowe, an independent goblin with his own thriving business, chose to work with Thrall in establishing a new nation. The mission, called The Long March, is set in the rocky, arid terrain of what would become Durotar, a landscape of red stone and sparse thorn scrub and occasional outcroppings of the hardened lava that attested to the volcanic history of the region. Thrall's forces are moving through this territory, establishing forward positions and dealing with the threats that the land presents. The dark spear trolls under Vol'jin are somewhere in this picture as well, newly allied with the Horde, their own island homeland lost, bringing their considerable combat skills and their entirely distinctive cultural character to this new alliance. The Tauren of the Barrens are further afield, Cairn Bloodhoof's people navigating their own relationship with this new horde that has arrived in what they consider their territory. And in the middle of all of this, coordinating the physical construction that would convert a military march into a permanent settlement was Gazlowe. The specific engineering challenges of Durotar were not minor. The terrain that Thrall had chosen for the new horde's home was selected for its defensibility and its separation from the human settlements of the eastern kingdoms, not for its agricultural or construction potential. Building in Durotar meant working with rock that was hard and red and difficult to quarry without the specialized tools that the Horde did not yet have in adequate quantities. It meant hauling timber from the forests to the northeast across distances long enough to make the logistics complicated. It meant finding water sources in a region where surface water was scarce, and drilling wells was a process that required both engineering knowledge and the willingness to go wrong several times before getting it right. The Darkspear trolls that Vol'jin led were among the groups building in this early period, and they brought with them an architecture tradition that was different from the Orcish model. Lighter structures, more wood-reliant, faster to build, but less permanent. Gazlowe's job was partly to integrate these different building traditions into something that could function as a unified city. The Tauren who worked alongside Orcish laborers had their own preferences and their own skills. The first phase of Orgrimmar's construction was a negotiation as much as it was a construction project, figuring out what each group could contribute, how the different building styles could complement rather than contradict each other, and what the city needed that none of the available traditions quite provided. The enemies during this period were not primarily the Alliance. The Alliance was far away, the eastern kingdoms, the distant continent from which the orcs had come, separated by the vast expanse of the Great Sea. The threats in Durotar were local, the Quilboar of the Barrens, pressed from the south. Various troll factions, not the Darkspear who were Horde allies, but the Razormane and the remnants of other troll tribes who regarded this new Orcish settlement as an intrusion into territory they had contested for generations, attacked the construction sites and the supply lines. Harpies from the mountain ridges raided the settlement's food stores, and the Centaur, the aggressive, nomadic half-human, half-horse warriors who roamed the Barrens and the steppes to the south, were a constant military pressure on anything the Horde tried to establish. The walls went up first. This was the priority that Thrall and Gazlowe agreed on from the beginning. You build the walls before you build anything else, because without the walls, everything else gets destroyed. The walls of early Orgrimmar were rough, massive stones mortared together with the best mortar that could be made from local materials, crenellated at the top to provide defenders with cover, pierced at intervals for the archers who would man them. They were not beautiful. They were adequate. They held. Inside the walls, the construction proceeded according to a plan that Gazlowe designed and adjusted as circumstances required. The Valley of Honor, the district where the Horde's warriors lived and trained and maintained their equipment, went up first after the walls. Then the Valley of Strength, the commercial heart of the city, where the marketplaces and the bank and the auction house would eventually establish themselves. The Valley of Wisdom, where the shaman conducted their ceremonies and the spiritual life of the Horde found its institutional home. The Cleft of Shadow, where the rogues and warlocks practiced arts that the Horde was not entirely comfortable with, but was practically enough to include. He could have remained neutral. The Steamweedle Cartel's model was neutrality, and Gazlowe had built Ratchet on that model. He could have sold supplies and engineering services to the orcs at standard rates and called it business. He did not do that. He got involved. He became the chief engineer of what would become Durotar and the city of Orgrimmar, throwing his engineering genius and his personal credibility behind a project that had no guarantee of success and a great many ways it could fail. Why? This is the question that defines Gazlowe's character. The cynical interpretation that he saw commercial opportunity in being the indispensable engineer of a new nation is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. Gazlowe is a businessman, and he was not unaware of the economic dimensions of his position. But the consistent pattern of his choices across decades of Warcraft history suggests something more than pure calculation. He believed in what Thrall was trying to do. The new Horde, the vision of a Horde that governed by honor rather than by the demonic corruption that had controlled it before, that built rather than destroyed, that found a home and worked the land and raised families in something resembling peace, was a better version of the world than what Gazlowe had grown up in. He had spent his career building things for people who needed them. He had spent years constructing a neutral harbor, specifically because he believed that places where people could meet and trade and not kill each other were more valuable than places where they couldn't. Thrall was trying to build a society along roughly those principles at enormous scale and against considerable odds. Gazlowe said yes. He did not stop being a goblin. He continued to operate Ratchet. He continued to charge for his engineering services. He was not a charity, and he was not pretending to be. But he put his skills and his judgment and his presence into the project of building the new Horde's capital, and he stayed through the hard parts, and he helped make it real. The construction of the early Horde settlements in Durotar is one of the least glamorous chapters in Warcraft history, and also one of the most important. No legendary weapons were forged, no great battles were won, no cosmological powers were invoked. What happened was that a lot of goblins and orcs and tauren and trolls built roads and walls and docks and smithies and granaries in a desert under the direction of a green goblin who understood structural engineering and was constitutionally incapable of accepting a solution that would fall down. Orgrimmar took shape. Thrall's vision acquired physical form through Gazlowe's engineering. The great gates, the heavy iron-reinforced timber doors set into the stone walls, large enough to admit a loaded wagon or a mounted warrior, designed to withstand the kind of assault that the Horde's enemies were capable of delivering, were built to Gazlowe's specifications, with the iron fittings cast in a foundry he had established in the construction camp during the first weeks of the project. The warrior district, the Valley of Honor, the maze of rope bridges connecting Orgrimmar's tiered districts, these were built under Gazlowe's supervision, designed to serve the needs of a community that did not yet fully know what it needed. The The city was built for heat and defensibility and capacity. Durotar is hot and dry and vulnerable to alliance raids from the sea, and Orgrimmar needed to be a fortress as well as a home. The rope bridges were a Gazlowe innovation that became one of Orgrimmar's most distinctive features. The city was built across uneven terrain. The redstone ridges and gullies that characterized Durotar's landscape meant that the flat urban grid typical of planned cities was simply not available. Different districts sat at different elevations, connected by the natural stone passages between ridges. Rope bridges over the gullies provided fast connection between districts without requiring the massive earth moving that a conventional road network would have demanded. They were also, practically speaking, more defensible. A bridge can be cut in an emergency, which a road cannot. Gazlowe navigated those competing demands with the practical intelligence that defined his entire career. The city that resulted was not elegant in the way that Silvermoon is elegant, or architecturally sophisticated in the way that Stormwind is architecturally sophisticated. It was functional and powerful and honest about what it was. A city for warriors and workers, built to last, designed to serve. His relationship with Thrall during this construction period established the dynamic that would define their interactions for decades. Thrall was clear about what he needed: a defensible city, built quickly, capable of housing a population that was still arriving from the sea and from the internment camps, with the facilities that a young nation required to function. He trusted Gazlowe to figure out how to provide it. He did not micromanage the engineering decisions. He did not insist on being consulted about every structural choice. He hired the best engineer he had access to and got out of the way. Gazlowe reciprocated by telling Thrall, plainly and without political softening, when a request was impossible. When Thrall wanted the Great Gates built in 2 weeks, and Gazlowe calculated that the timeline for getting the iron fittings cast and the timber seasoned enough to not warp in Durotar's dry heat was closer to 5, he said so, and he said why, and he offered the alternative of building a simpler temporary gate on the 2-week timeline that could be replaced by the proper gate when it was ready. Thrall said yes to that. It became the pattern. Gazlowe told the truth about what could be done and when, and Thrall made his plans around that truth rather than around what he wished were possible. This dynamic was, in the context of Thrall's leadership experience, refreshing. He had spent the liberation of the internment camps, surrounded by warriors whose default mode was optimistic assurance. Yes, Warchief, we can do that, because admitting limitation in a warrior culture is uncomfortable. Gazlowe had no warrior culture to maintain. He had a reputation for accurate estimates to protect, and he protected it by being honest. The years that followed the Third War established Gazlowe as one of the most recognizable figures in Horde-adjacent territory, operating from Ratchet with his characteristic combination of commercial pragmatism and personal decency. Ratchet, under his management, in the World of Warcraft Classic era, is a genuinely functional neutral settlement, not idyllic, not without its complications, but a place that works in the way that Gazlowe's places generally work. Players who explored the Barrens in those early years of the game encountered Gazlowe as the de facto mayor and boss of Ratchet. Short, confident, surrounded by the constant low-level noise of a working port town, running everything with an easy authority that came not from formal appointment, but from being the most competent person in the room. He is not a bureaucrat. He does not hold court or issue proclamations. He makes deals, solves problems, and expects results. The physical Ratchet that players explored was a particular kind of place, a frontier port that had grown organically rather than been planned from above. The dock district occupied the eastern edge of the town, extending out into the harbor with multiple piers at different lengths for vessels of different sizes. The dock smell, salt water and old timber, and the particular pungency of dried fish being loaded into crates for inland delivery was present from the moment you came around the last headland on the coastal road. The warehouses behind the docks were enormous relative to the other buildings in town, their wide doors open to allow the movement of crates and barrels and the wrapped packages that merchants preferred not to have examined too closely. The market area occupied the center of town, a collection of stalls and permanent vendor stalls where goods from every continent passed through on their way from ships to buyers. Alliance goods sat next to Horde goods, sat next to things that had been traded through enough hands that their origin was genuinely unclear. Goblin vendors with the particular mercantile energy that Ratchet seemed to concentrate argued prices and demonstrated products and replenished their stock with the constant restless motion of people whose profession required them to always be doing something. The inn was better than it had any right to be for a frontier port. Gazlowe had personally supervised its construction and had insisted on higher standards than strictly necessary: proper ventilation, adequate sleeping quarters, a kitchen capable of producing food that was not merely sufficient, but actually good. His reasoning was characteristic. Merchants who slept well and ate well came back. Merchants who did not slept in their ships and ate what they brought and spent less in Ratchet's economy. The inn was an investment in repeat business. The boat to Menethil Harbor ran on a regular schedule, one of the most important regular services in Ratchet's operation, connecting the Barrens coast to the eastern kingdoms and providing the primary maritime link between the Horde's Kalimdor territories and the continent where the Alliance was based. The boat was operated on contract with a shipping company that had been negotiated into reasonably good terms by Gazlowe in one of the more complicated commercial negotiations in Ratchet's history. The shipping company had wanted exclusivity, the right to be the only maritime service operating from Ratchet, and Gazlowe had given them the route to Menethil in exchange for price ceilings that meant the boat remained affordable to the merchants and adventurers who depended on it. He had also, in the same negotiation, built in a provision that if the shipping company failed to maintain the schedule for 3 consecutive months, the exclusivity lapsed. This provision had been tested twice, both times resulting in a renegotiation that produced slightly better terms for Ratchet and slightly worse ones for the shipping company. Gazlowe was not vindictive about it. He did not gloat. He simply pointed out in both cases that this was what the contract said and asked whether they wanted to proceed on those terms or work out something more mutually satisfactory. They always wanted to work out something more mutually satisfactory, which was, of course, the point. The goblin aesthetic of Ratchet, the rickety wooden docks, the mismatched architecture of buildings that were added over time as the settlement grew, the mixture of merchant stalls and warehouses and a surprisingly decent inn, all of it reflected Gazlowe's practical approach to civic development. Build what you need when you need it. Make it solid. Don't overthink the aesthetics. The Barrens region in Classic was famous for being enormous, contested, and full of variety. From the crossroads in the center, an important Horde hub and the target of seemingly endless alliance raids in the game's early years, to the southern transition into Dustwallow Marsh. From the mountains to the west, where the Wailing Caverns and the ruins of ancient troll civilization lurked, to the eastern shore, where Ratchet sat. Gazlowe's port was the connection point between this landlocked interior and the rest of Azeroth. Ships came and went, carrying players from Menethil Harbor in the wetlands. Goods moved through Ratchet's docks to Horde and neutral markets across the continent. He was present throughout this period as a stable, grounded presence in a region that was constantly in flux. Players came through Ratchet, picked up quests, bought goods, took the boat, moved on. Gazlowe was always there, running his port, dealing with his suppliers, navigating the complications of maintaining neutrality in an increasingly polarized world. The stability, the consistency of a person who shows up, does the work, and keeps things running is a quality that gets undervalued in narratives dominated by dramatic transformation and cosmic stakes. Gazlowe's contribution to the early Horde's survival was not a single heroic act. It was 20 years of showing up and making things work. The Cataclysm changed the landscape of Gazlowe's world in ways that were both personal and political. But to understand why Deathwing's return mattered so specifically and so catastrophically to the goblins, you need to understand what Kazan was. The Isle of Kazan was not simply a geographic location. It was the birthplace of goblin civilization, the place where everything that made goblins what they were had originated. Mount Kaja'mite dominated the island's geography, a volcanic peak that had been active for as long as goblin memory reached. The city of Kazan itself occupied the island's coastal terraces, arranged in the tiers of cartel wealth that defined goblin society. The closer your neighborhood was to the summit, the more your family was worth. Cartel executives lived in sprawling compounds with views of the harbor. Workers lived in the mountain's shadow, in districts that smelled of sulfur and the particular industrial output of a goblin city operating at maximum commercial intensity. The kaja'mite deposits were not at the surface. They were deep in the volcanic rock, in the same geological formation that made the mountain active. Every generation, the mining operations went deeper to follow the seams. Every generation, the mineral became rarer and the exposure weaker. The goblins noticed this. The engineers and scholars among them tracked the cognitive effects of diminishing exposure, ran studies that they mostly suppressed because the conclusions were uncomfortable for cartel interests, and occasionally published papers that were read by other engineers and scholars and ignored by the people who made decisions about mining operations. The kaja'mite was running out. This was known. The full implications of what this meant, not just for current goblins, but for every goblin who would ever live after the deposits were exhausted, were not confronted. They were not confronted because confronting them would have required the cartel system to make decisions that prioritized long-term goblin welfare over short-term profit extraction, and the cartel system was not designed to make those decisions. Deathwing's return from Deepholm reshaped the physical world across every continent, but the most catastrophic single event for the goblins was the eruption of Mount Kaja'ro. The volcano that had defined goblin civilization for thousands of years erupted with a force that dwarfed anything in recorded goblin history. The geological event was direct. Deathwing's passage through the Earth's crust disturbed the tectonic plates in patterns that propagated across the world, and Kazan sat on a particularly unstable section of the ocean floor. The eruption began with the usual warning signs: increased tremors, elevated gas emissions, water in the coastal harbors turning warm and slightly discolored, and then accelerated into something that made the warning signs seem insignificant. The lava flows came fast, not the slow, dramatic lava flows of tourist attraction volcanoes, but the fast kind, the kind that move at running pace and generate superheated gases ahead of them that are lethal before the lava itself arrives. The harbors became choked with ash and pumice. The commercial district of Kazan, the markets and trading floors and banking institutions that were the nervous system of the Bilgewater Cartel economy, began to disappear under meters of ashfall within the hours of the eruption's intensification. The trade prince of the Bilgewater Cartel at the time of this catastrophe was Jaster Gallywix. He was, by the standards of goblin trade princes, remarkably suited to the position, extraordinarily wealthy, politically connected, personally intelligent in the narrow commercial sense, and almost completely without conscience. He had held the trade prince position for years, accumulating wealth through the mechanisms that the Bilgewater Cartel's institutional structure made available, treating the cartel's membership as a resource to be extracted rather than a constituency to be served. Gallywix charged goblins for passage on his evacuation ships, not a nominal administrative fee, everything they had, every possession, every piece of coin, in exchange for seats on boats that were the only way off an island that was literally erupting beneath their feet. The Bilgewater goblins signed over their lives' savings and their freedom to trade Prince Gallywix, who immediately converted this catastrophe into the largest single transfer of wealth in Bilgewater Cartel history. The scene at Kazan's harbors during the evacuation is one of the most morally clarifying moments in goblin lore. Goblins who had spent their entire lives working within the Bilgewater Cartel system, who had accepted the system's terms, played by its rules, accumulated whatever modest savings the system allowed them to accumulate, arrived at the docks with what they owned and discovered that what they owned was the price of passage, and if they paid it, they would arrive wherever the ships were going with nothing. The alternative was the lava, which was coming faster than anyone had expected. Most of them paid. They had no other choice. The ones who refused to pay, or who could not pay, or who arrived at the docks too late, their fate was what you would expect on an island that was erupting. Gallywix watched this process from the comfort of his personal evacuation vessel, the largest and best appointed ship in the harbor, already loaded with his personal wealth and the wealth he had just extracted from his people, and calculated his position. The situation became worse in short order. The evacuation fleet was captured by Alliance naval forces, specifically by Admiral Proudmoore's fleet, which had been operating in the region, and the goblins were enslaved, briefly because a player character goblin organized a revolt and they escaped. They found themselves adrift in the ocean, eventually shipwrecked off the coast of the Lost Isles, a small archipelago in the middle of the ocean with no particular strategic value and a remarkable amount of danger in the form of local wildlife, hostile primates, and the wreckage of their own fleet scattered across the reefs. The Lost Isles storyline in the Cataclysm Goblin starting zone is one of the most complete portraits of the Bilgewater Goblin experience in all of Warcraft's playable content. It shows what happens to a people who have been stripped of everything, who have landed somewhere hostile with the resources that happen to survive the shipwreck, and who have to improvise survival while dealing with internal political dysfunction in the form of a trade prince who is still somehow trying to find an angle to profit from the situation. Gallywix continued to be Gallywix throughout this process, exploitative, cowardly when directly threatened, manipulative, and fundamentally incapable of caring about anything except his own position. On the Lost Isles, he tried to re-establish his authority over the surviving Bilgewater goblins by controlling the supplies from the wreckage. He made deals with local threats, the hostile ape population of the Isles, local elemental entities, that he calculated would benefit him regardless of what happened to the goblins he was nominally leading. He attempted to sell information about the goblin refugees to the Alliance forces that were also present on the Isles. The player character Goblin organized the survivors, eventually defeated Gallywix in a direct confrontation, and brought the Bilgewater Cartel to the shores of Kalimdor, seeking alliance with the Horde. Thrall, recognizing that goblins with engineering skills and commercial networks were a meaningful addition to the Horde's capabilities, welcomed them. The Bilgewater Cartel joined the Horde. Gallywix survived this process and remarkably retained his position as trade prince. The political compromise that allowed this, Thrall had other wars to fight and a world to save, and could not spend unlimited time on Bilgewater internal politics, left the cartel in the hands of someone who had demonstrated his willingness to enslave his own people during a natural disaster. The new Bilgewater home territory was carved out of the northern Barrens, the area around Bilgewater Harbor, on the coast not far from where Ratchet had been operating for years. This put the Bilgewater Cartel in Ratchet's backyard, so to speak, and created a dynamic between Gazlowe's steam wheedle operation and the Bilgewater's new Horde-aligned commercial presence that was complicated in ways that the steam wheedle's traditional neutrality made awkward to navigate. Gazlowe was not Bilgewater Cartel. He was steam wheedle. But the entrance of the Bilgewater Cartel into the Horde and Gallywix's particular style of leadership created dynamics that Gazlowe would eventually have to navigate. The two major goblin factions operating in and around the Horde's territory now had very different relationships with the institution. The steam wheedle maintained their traditional neutrality and commercial independence, while the Bilgewater were formerly Horde members under the leadership of a figure who had demonstrated that he would exploit every crisis for personal gain. The contrast between Gallywix and Gazlowe is the central tension of goblin politics in the Horde era. They represent different answers to the same question. What does it mean to be a goblin? Gallywix's answer starts with a premise and builds a coherent system from it. The premise is that resources are finite, and competition for them is zero-sum. If you have more, I have less, and therefore the correct strategy is always to accumulate as much as possible before someone else accumulates it instead. This logic leads directly to the practices that defined his trade princedom: charging for evacuation, enslaving people temporarily when the opportunity presented itself, making deals with hostile parties when those deals benefited him regardless of the cost to everyone else. These were not aberrations. They were the rational conclusions of a coherent worldview applied consistently and without sentiment. Gazlowe's answer starts with a different premise. Resources are finite, yes, but the total amount of resources available is not fixed. It grows when people cooperate to produce more than they could individually. The correct strategy is therefore to build systems of cooperation that produce value greater than what any party could produce alone, and to structure those systems so that the value produced is distributed in ways that sustain the cooperation rather than poisoning it. This logic leads to neutral ports and fair wages and honest contracts and the willingness to tell a client that their project will take longer than they want to hear because telling the truth now costs less than the alternative. Both answers are, in some sense, within the range of goblin cultural values. The difference is in what those values are deployed in service of. Gallywix understood what Gazlowe represented and found it irritating in the particular way that people who have built their identity around a commercial philosophy tend to find principled alternatives irritating. Gazlowe's success, the fact that Ratchet worked, that the Horde respected him, that his word was worth something, was an implicit argument against Gallywix's approach, and Gallywix was too commercially intelligent not to understand the argument, even as he rejected it. The feeling was reciprocal. Gazlowe had no illusions about what Gallywix was. He had watched the Kazan evacuation and the Lost Isles situation from his own position in the Barrens, had heard the accounts from Bilgewater goblins who passed through Ratchet on their way to the new territories, and had formed his view of Gallywix's character with the same directness with which he formed his views of construction materials. The trade prince was structurally unsound. The question was whether the cartel could be salvaged when Gallywix eventually fell. The Cataclysm expansion brought Gazlowe into a new political context without fundamentally changing who he was. He remained present in Ratchet throughout this period, a fixed point in a world that was being reshaped by geological catastrophe and the reorganization of Azeroth's physical geography. Some of the Barrens split apart. The southern Barrens became a distinct zone from the northern, scarred by new rifts and environmental damage. The Alliance-Horde conflict in the region intensified as both factions competed for resources in a destabilized landscape. Ratchet maintained its neutrality throughout, which was both a commercial necessity and a reflection of Gazlowe's consistent philosophy. When everything around you is being reorganized by faction politics and geological disaster, a neutral port that both sides can still use is more valuable than ever. Gazlowe understood this and managed accordingly. He also began appearing more explicitly in Horde-adjacent storylines as the Horde's need for engineering expertise increased. The combination of Deathwing's damage to the world's infrastructure, the intensifying war with the Alliance, and the particular demands of operating military and civilian facilities in multiple difficult environments, volcanic regions, underwater locations, increasingly hostile terrain, made Gazlowe's skills more relevant than ever to Horde leadership. One of the less discussed consequences of the Cataclysm for Ratchet, specifically, was the disruption of established shipping routes. Several of the maritime passages that Ratchet-dependent ships had used for years were altered by the geological changes Deathwing's emergence caused. Shallow reefs pushed closer to the surface in some areas, formerly navigable channels blocked by new rock formations in others. Gazlowe spent a significant portion of the immediate post-Cataclysm period working with the maritime pilots who operated in and out of Ratchet to remap the harbor approaches and the coastal route north toward Ashara. It was detailed, unglamorous, essential work that most people never knew was being done because its success was measured by the absence of shipwrecks rather than by anything visible. This relevance would become dramatically more explicit in the years to come. The mists of Pandaria era brought the Horde into the most serious internal crisis it had faced since its founding. Garrosh Hellscream, who had taken the title of War Chief after Thrall stepped down to focus on world saving, had been moving in an increasingly troubling direction since his elevation, pushing an aggressive expansionism that privileged Orcish power over the Horde's multicultural composition, pursuing military objectives with a disregard for civilian cost that became increasingly difficult to justify, and eventually making choices that crossed into atrocity. Garrosh's relationship with the non-Orcish Horde members had always been complicated. He had the cultural blind spots of someone who had grown up hearing the old stories of Orcish glory and who had never fully internalized the post-corruption Horde's commitment to building something new rather than recapturing something old. In practice, this meant that Tauren concerns were heard, but often overridden on military grounds. Troll contributions were valued. Instrumentally, Vol'jin's forces were genuinely useful in combat, so they got missions. Blood Elf political leverage was respected because the Blood Elves had enough leverage to demand respect. Goblin contributions were valued as engineering and logistics support without the goblins themselves being treated as full members of the coalition. Gazlowe navigated this environment the way he navigated most difficult environments, by being too useful to dismiss and too independent to fully control. Garrosh needed his engineering. He needed the engineering tradition that Gazlowe represented. He could not afford to alienate the one goblin whose reputation for competence made him the first call for any project that actually had to work. So he used the services and kept the disdain mostly private, and Gazlowe accepted the arrangement because he was not there for Garrosh's respect. He was there because the Horde needed what he could provide. The discovery of Pandaria, a continent hidden for 10,000 years behind a magical mist, created an immediate conflict over the continent's resources, particularly the pools of Sha energy that could be tapped for military power. Garrosh weaponized this energy, experimented on prisoners, and eventually used a bomb of compressed Sha power against civilians in Theramore, killing thousands. He then moved into Pandaria with the intention of claiming its ancient power for an Orcish empire. The bombing of Theramore was, for many Horde members, the moment when they stopped being able to rationalize Garrosh's trajectory. It was not a military target. It was not even a strategic target in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration of power, of willingness to do what other leaders had been unwilling to do, of a particular view of what the Horde's relationship to the rest of Azeroth should be. For Horde members who had joined the coalition because Thrall's vision offered something different from the old destructive Horde. A Horde that built, that earned respect, that governed by honor. The bomb was the notification that Garrosh had chosen a different path. For goblins specifically, the Garrosh era created a particular kind of difficulty. The Bilgewater Cartel was formally Horde, which meant Gallywix was nominally answerable to Garrosh's directives. Garrosh found Gallywix useful. Both figures shared a preference for transactional relationships, and neither had much patience for idealism, and the Bilgewater's engineering resources were deployed extensively in support of Garrosh's military projects. This made the Bilgewater complicit in the Theramore bombing and the subsequent atrocities in ways that would require addressing when Garrosh fell. Gazlowe watched all of this from a position of careful distance. He continued to provide engineering services to the Horde on the terms he had always provided them. Fair prices for honest work, delivery on time and on specification, refusal to do work he believed was specifically aimed at harming civilians. The last category was tested more frequently in the Garrosh era than in any previous period, and Gazlowe's track record of saying no when saying no was correct became a point of quiet tension between him and the Warchief's apparatus. The Siege of Orgrimmar, which concluded the Mists of Pandaria storyline, was the response from within the Horde itself. Horde leaders who had watched Garrosh's trajectory with increasing alarm, combined with alliance forces that had every reason to want Garrosh removed, went into Orgrimmar to end his rule. Gazlowe was present. This is not a detail that gets a lot of narrative attention in the game's storytelling, but it matters. He was there in Orgrimmar, aligned with the forces opposing Garrosh, participating in the effort to reclaim the Horde's capital from a warchief who had turned it into something the Horde's founders would not have recognized. His involvement was, characteristically, practical. The Siege of Orgrimmar required logistics, engineering support, and someone who knew Orgrimmar's physical structure well enough to navigate around its defenses. Gazlowe had built parts of that structure. He knew it. He knew where the walls were thickest and where they were merely impressive looking. He knew which of the gates had been reinforced since original construction and which had not. He knew the passages between districts that did not appear on the plans Garrosh's engineers had been given because Gazlowe had built them for utility rather than for official documentation. There is a particular grimness to using your intimate knowledge of something you built to help defeat the people who took it over. Gazlowe had built Orgrimmar to be a home for the Horde. He was now navigating it in the service of reclaiming it from a warchief who had corrupted what it was supposed to be. The city itself had not changed. The walls were the same walls. The gates were the same gates. The streets were the same streets. The thing that had changed was what the city was being used for, and that change was what made this moment necessary. After Garrosh's defeat and removal, Vol'jin of the Darkspear Trolls was named the new warchief, a choice that reflected both the Horde's recognition of what Garrosh had done and the belief that a different kind of leader was needed. Vol'jin's selection was itself a departure from precedent. The warchief had always been an orc, and the selection of a troll represented the Horde's acknowledgement that it was not an orcish organization with non-Orcish auxiliaries, but a genuine coalition of peoples. This was the kind of horde that Gazlowe had believed in from the beginning. He found the selection appropriate. Gazlowe continued in his various roles, the city that he had helped build, now governed by a leader who shared, at least in part, his vision of what the Horde should be. Warlords of Draenor took Gazlowe into entirely new territory, both literally and metaphorically. The expansion's storyline involved a time travel complication of considerable lore significance. An alternate timeline's version of Garrosh had traveled back in time to prevent the original Horde from drinking the demonic blood that would have corrupted them, creating an alternate Iron Horde whose military technology and organization made them an immediate threat to the present-day world. The player opened a dark portal into this alternate Draenor and established a military presence there. The player's military headquarters on alternate Draenor was the Garrison, a base of operations that grew over the course of the expansion from a small outpost to a significant fortification. And the architect of that garrison, the goblin responsible for its design, construction, and continued expansion, was Gazlowe. He appears in the Horde Garrison storyline as the principal engineer, greeting the player on arrival at Frostwall, the Horde Garrison location in alternate Frostfire Ridge, and overseeing its development throughout the expansion. This is Gazlowe doing what Gazlowe does, looking at a situation that requires construction under difficult conditions and making it happen. But Frostwall presented challenges that were genuinely different from anything in Gazlowe's considerable engineering experience. Frostfire Ridge was, as the name suggests, simultaneously frozen and volcanic, a geological combination that resulted from the specific tectonic character of this alternate Draenor, where enormous volcanic calderas sat adjacent to glacial plains, where rivers ran warm in places and icy in others, where the ground could shift between permafrost and volcanic rock within a few hundred meters. Building in this environment required simultaneous management of two sets of structural problems that were almost directly contradictory. For cold environments, you insulate, you build dense, you dig foundations deep to get below the frost line. For volcanic environments, you ventilate, you use materials with high heat tolerance, you build away from fault lines, and monitor seismic activity constantly. In Frostfire Ridge, you had to do both at once in the same structure, and the materials that worked well for one set of conditions were frequently wrong for the other. Gazlowe figured it out. He developed a layered wall construction technique that used the volcanic rock, which was abundant locally, as structural material, combined with an insulating inner layer made from materials sourced from the glacial margins, with ventilation channels designed to circulate air without allowing the cold to penetrate the interior. The foundation design went to exceptional depth, well below the frost line, anchored into the non-volcanic bedrock that existed under the surface geology. The roofing was the hardest problem. It needed to shed snow loads while withstanding the ashfall from periodic volcanic events in the region. He solved the roofing problem with a solution he was characteristically blunt about. He told the player character that it was ugly, that it looked like someone had dropped a large pile of material on top of the building and called it architecture, but that it would not fall down and it would not leak, and it would shed both snow and ash without requiring more maintenance than could be provided by a garrison crew that had other things to worry about. The buildings at Frostwall do, in fact, look like that. They are also, notably, still standing. The Garrison storyline gave players substantial time with Gazlowe in a way that earlier appearances had not. The extended interaction over the course of an expansion allowed his character to develop beyond a single notable trait or a cameo. He was funny, the jokes land, and they are genuinely goblin jokes, the kind of humor that comes from seeing the world primarily in terms of what things cost and what they are worth. Standing in Frostfire Ridge, while Iron Horde ogres attempted to breach the garrison walls from the south and a blizzard came in from the north, he was entirely capable of observing that the weather was probably going to be a bigger structural problem than the ogres, and that he had not charged enough for the winter proofing of the eastern barracks. He was competent in ways that were consistently demonstrated rather than just asserted. Every building he promised was built. Every upgrade he said was possible was completed on the timeline he gave, using the materials he specified. In a game about building a military base in an alien landscape on an alternate version of another world, the baseline expectation is that things will go wrong in surprising ways. Gazlowe's contributions were the part of the garrison that did not go wrong. He also demonstrated something important about how he relates to authority. He works well with strong leaders who have clear goals and the sense to let him do his job. He does not need to be the one making strategic decisions. He is not interested in being the war chief, but he is also not someone who accepts orders without evaluation. He will tell you if he thinks something is a bad idea, and he will tell you clearly. The relationship between Gazlowe and the player character in the Garrison storyline has a comfortable directness that reflects his baseline relationship with authority throughout his career. When the Garrison commander decided to build a particular structure that Gazlowe thought was a low priority, given the Garrison's current defensive situation, Gazlowe said so. He said it once, made the case clearly, and when the commander proceeded anyway, he built the structure. This was not passive-aggressive compliance. It was the behavior of a professional who knows that his job is to advise and then to execute, not to substitute his judgment for his clients once the decision has been made. He made his position clear. The decision went against him. He did the work. He also noted, without excessive drama, when the structure turned out to be less useful than the alternative he had suggested, and the notation was not vindictive, just informational for the purposes of future planning. The garrison in Frostwall became, over the course of the expansion, a genuinely formidable installation. Its development tracked the expansion's progression from the initial small outpost that could barely support a forward scouting force to a fortified headquarters capable of launching operations across alternate Draenor. Gazlowe's engineering made that progression possible, adapting designs to an alien landscape in an alternate timeline, working with materials and terrain features that had no direct equivalent on Azeroth. The Iron Horde's own engineering was, Gazlowe noted with professional interest, surprisingly good. The alternate Draenor orcs had developed siege weapon technology and fortification techniques independently of the Azeroth orc tradition, and some of what they had produced was genuinely clever. He studied the Iron Horde siege weapons that were captured or destroyed near the garrison with the focused attention of a craftsman looking at work done by someone from a different school, appreciating what was smart, noting what was not, filing the information away for future reference. The garrison in Frostwall became, over the course of the expansion, the platform from which the Horde's campaign in alternate Draenor was conducted. The forces that operated from it survived, which is ultimately the only metric that matters for a military installation in a contested alternate timeline dimension. Heroes of the Storm gave Gazlowe a life outside of the Warcraft narrative that expanded his characterization in ways that the main game had not fully explored. He is a playable hero in the Nexus, the battle arena that pulls characters from Blizzard's various game universes into conflict with each other, and his portrayal there is the fullest expression of his personality that the franchise has offered. His combat style relies on his engineering. He fights with mechanical turrets, bombs, a gravity lasso, and his own oversized fists when things get close enough that engineering no longer helps. His play style rewards unconventional tactics and the creative deployment of his devices, which is fitting. The gravity lasso in particular is a Gazlowe signature, a device that generates a gravitational field capable of pulling a target toward him and holding them in place for several seconds, long enough for his other devices to do their work. It is the kind of engineering that reflects his specific mind, not a weapon designed to damage the opponent directly, but a tool designed to change the terms of the engagement, to make the situation into something that suits his particular combination of capabilities. But the dialogue, the voice lines, the interactions with other heroes, the character moments that the MOBA format allowed the writers to include, reveals a Gazlowe who is self-aware, good-humored, and remarkably consistent in his values across contexts. He trades jokes with other heroes. He is genuinely enthusiastic about combat in a way that is recognizably goblin, not bloodthirsty, but practically excited about the engineering challenges that combat presents. His devices need targets. The Nexus provides them. His interactions with Thrall in the Nexus are particularly revealing. The two of them, placed in an arena where they are technically opponents as often as allies, maintain the comfortable shorthand of people who have worked together long enough to not need to perform their relationship for external observers. There is no deference in how Gazlowe talks to Thrall, but there is respect, the kind that comes from watching someone make hard decisions well over a long period of time. And when Thrall wins an engagement, Gazlowe's commentary tends to be something like, "Well, that worked, though I would have put a turret here and saved everyone about 30 seconds. Some of his interactions are with other Warcraft characters, Sylvanas, the various Alliance figures who appear in the game. In these interactions, the history between Gazlowe and the Horde is present. He is on the Horde's side by default, not because he has some deep ideological commitment to Horde supremacy, but because the Horde is where his work is and where his people are. He is a practical ally rather than a fervent believer, and this comes through in how he talks about the conflict. He is also funny in a way that the main game does not always give him space to be. The humor is specifically goblin humor, a kind of deadpan commercial pragmatism applied to situations that the humor-generating part of Gazlowe's mind finds inherently absurd. He is in a magical battle arena, fighting heroes from multiple universes. He is a short green engineer with a mechanical lasso and some bombs. He is aware of the absurdity. He rolls with it. When a particularly powerful cosmic hero enters the arena and begins displaying the kind of reality-altering capabilities that the most dangerous entities in Blizzard's various universes possess, Gazlowe's comment tends to be something about whether there is a market for whatever that power is, and whether anyone has thought about how to put it on a contract basis. The joke is not just a joke. It is a worldview expressed in humor. Everything, including apocalyptic power, can be usefully framed in commercial terms, because commercial terms are the ones that matter when you need something done. This quality, the ability to find the genuine comedy in your circumstances without losing sight of what you're actually doing, is one of the most appealing things about Gazlowe as a character. He does not take himself too seriously. He takes his work very seriously. These two things coexist comfortably in a person who knows exactly what he is good at and does not need everything else to be meaningful in order to feel that his life has been worth living. Battle for Azeroth returned Gazlowe to the center of events in a way that set up everything that would follow. The expansion's storyline, the renewed full-scale war between the Horde and Alliance following the burning of Teldrassil and the fall of Lordaeron, put every Horde figure in an impossible position. Sylvanas Windrunner had taken the Warchief title after Vol'jin's death at the Broken Shore, and had been making choices that the expansion's story progressively revealed to be oriented toward goals that were not the Horde's goals. The burning of Teldrassil, the Night Elf World Tree, home to hundreds of thousands of civilians, was the most visible expression of this divergence. Sylvanas ordered it burned not as a military objective, but as an act of despair generation, a move designed to drive the population of Azeroth toward hopelessness for reasons that turned out to be cosmological rather than political. The Horde did not know that. What the Horde knew was that it had burned a world tree and killed civilians for no apparent military purpose, and that the Alliance's response was going to be appropriately catastrophic. Vol'jin's death had hit the Horde hard in ways that the narrative of the expansion period did not always fully convey. He had been war chief for a relatively brief time, shorter than Thrall's tenure, far shorter than the years Garrosh had spent accumulating damage. But his leadership had represented something specific. The possibility that the Horde could be governed by values that were genuinely different from the ones that Garrosh had embodied. His death at the Broken Shore was sudden and unresolved, and left a question hanging about what the Horde would become without him. Sylvanas filled that vacuum with efficiency and skill. She was a brilliant political operator, a genuinely gifted military commander, and a figure whose actual goals were sufficiently concealed that the Horde spent years believing they were following a war chief when they were actually being maneuvered by someone whose primary allegiance was to an agenda none of them had agreed to. Gazlowe's reading of Sylvanas was, from fairly early in her warchief period, skeptical. This was not intuition, it was analysis. He watched how she made decisions. He noticed the pattern, decisions that made sense as Horde strategy mapped well onto outcomes that happened to serve her specific agenda, and decisions that seemed to diverge from Horde interest in ways that she provided increasingly thin justifications for. Engineers think about failure modes. Gazlowe looked at Sylvanas as a system and noted the failure modes she was creating. He did not have proof sufficient to act on. He had professional concern sufficient to be watchful. Gazlowe appears in battle for Azeroth through his goblin engineering crew, the Grease Monkeys, who work support operations for the Horde's war effort. His characterization in this period is continuous with everything he has been: practical, reliable, focused on making things work rather than on the political drama surrounding the war's direction. The Grease Monkeys repaired siege equipment, maintained the machinery that the war effort depended on, improvised solutions to the logistical problems that a large-scale military campaign generates in abundance. They were not heroic in the conventional sense. They were indispensable. The war campaign, from Gazlowe's perspective, had a specific quality that the narrative from other characters' perspectives tended to miss. The war was being fought with equipment that had been built by someone, and that someone was usually a goblin, and keeping that equipment running while people who had not built it subjected it to stresses it had not been designed for was an ongoing and deeply frustrating exercise in engineering triage. The Horde's war machines were not being damaged by the Alliance. Well, some of them were, but mostly they were being worn out by the pace of operations, by commanders who did not understand the maintenance schedules that kept them functional, by the basic entropy that affects any complex mechanical system that is being operated continuously in field conditions. Gazlowe's war was a maintenance war. It was the war of keeping things from falling apart. It was necessary, it was unglamorous, and it was exactly the kind of war that Gazlowe was good at. But the war's direction was becoming impossible to ignore. The revelations about Sylvanas' actual agenda, the deal with the jailer, the manipulation of events toward the destruction of the afterlife's structure, came to a head in the events leading into Shadowlands. Sylvanas abandoned the Horde at Icecrown Citadel, shattered the Helm of Domination, and disappeared into a conflict with cosmic stakes that the Horde had never signed up for and did not fully understand. The Horde was left without a war chief, following a war that turned out to have been fought for purposes its members had not consented to. The political crisis that followed required a new way of governing the Horde. A single war chief, a single point of failure, a single person whose choices could bind an entire diverse coalition to catastrophic ends was not the answer. The Horde's history was a succession of war chiefs whose individual failures had cost the Horde enormously. Garrosh's atrocities, Sylvanas' betrayal, the structural problem of concentrating that much authority in one person who could be corrupted or deceived or simply wrong. The solution was a council. The Horde Council, a governing body representing each major faction within the Horde, making collective decisions rather than deferring to a single leader, was the result. And among its members, representing the Bilgewater Cartel, was Gazlowe. The transition from Gazlowe as engineering contractor to Gazlowe as trade prince and Horde Council member requires some explanation because it is not as obvious as it might appear. He was not Bilgewater Cartel. He was Steamweedle. The Bilgewater Cartel, as it entered the Shadowlands era, was still nominally led by Gallywix, who had managed to hold on to his position despite the catastrophic evacuation of Kazan, despite the player character's rebellion against him during the Lost Isles storyline, despite a long and consistent record of prioritizing his own enrichment over his people's welfare. Gallywix had survived through political maneuvering and the Horde's relative inattention to internal Bilgewater politics, while larger crises demanded focus. The mechanisms of Gallywix's survival were themselves a study in the goblin cartel system at its most baroque. He had leverage over the people who might have challenged him, commercial leverage, the kind that came from knowing where money had gone and being willing to make that information inconvenient for people who opposed him. He had managed the Lost Isles crisis in ways that preserved his formal position, even as it destroyed his moral authority, because the political compromise that ended the conflict had been negotiated quickly, under pressure, by leaders who needed the Bilgewater's capabilities more immediately than they needed justice for what Gallywix had done during the evacuation. He had also, over the subsequent years, made himself useful to Garrosh in ways that positioned him as an embedded part of the Horde's war apparatus. When Garrosh fell, Gallywix survived by being too enmeshed in the Horde's infrastructure to remove, without disrupting things, the new leadership needed to keep running. When Sylvanas became war chief, he made similar calculations and similar arrangements. He was very good at reading power and attaching himself to it. The Shadowlands era changed that. The political crisis following Sylvanas's betrayal and the establishment of the Horde Council created an institutional reform moment in which the accumulated case against Gallywix's leadership could be acted on without the political costs that acting on it had always previously generated. He was removed. The specifics of his departure from power involve a combination of direct intervention by the new council structure and the cumulative weight of everything he had done catching up with him in a context where the people with the leverage to protect him no longer had reason to do so. He departed the scene. The Bilgewater Cartel needed new leadership, and Gazlowe was available. More specifically, Gazlowe was the goblin in the Horde's orbit, whose reputation was sufficient to make the Bilgewater membership accept the change without the resistance that an imposed outsider would have generated. He was known. He was respected. He had built things that they had used. He had demonstrated across decades of operation in and around Horde territory that his way of running a goblin enterprise was viable and produced better outcomes for the people who depended on it. His assumption of the Trade Prince title was not a conventional goblin political transition. He did not accumulate leverage through commercial maneuvering or buy out competing claimants or deploy economic pressure to eliminate rivals. He was offered the position because he was, by the assessment of the Horde's leadership and the Bilgewater goblins who knew him, the person most likely to use the Trade Prince's authority for the cartel's actual benefit rather than his own enrichment. This is a genuinely unusual thing to say about a goblin, that the reason someone was elevated to Trade Prince was specifically because they were less likely to abuse the position than the alternatives, that their credibility rested on a history of not doing the thing that goblin political culture treats as inevitable. Gazlowe's reputation, built over decades of practical work in Ratchet and Durotar and across every crisis he had navigated, was that he was fair. He charged for his work. He made his own living. But he did not take what was not his, and he did not exploit the people who depended on him. The Bilgewater goblins, who had spent years under Gallywix, who had been charged for passage on evacuation ships during a volcanic eruption, who had been enslaved and then technically rescued and then governed by someone whose principal concern remained his own financial position, responded to the change with something that goblin culture does not often produce: relief. The relief was not normally expressed because Bilgewater culture had decades of Gallywix era conditioning baked into it. There was a significant portion of the cartel's membership, particularly in the middle and upper management layers, who had survived under Gallywix by learning to operate in his image and who viewed the change in leadership with calculation rather than relief. What did this mean for their position? Was their accumulated leverage still worth what it had been? Were the relationships they had built under the old system still functional under the new one? Gazlowe was aware of this and had planned for it. He did not try to immediately reform the entire commercial structure of the Bilgewater Cartel. He began at the edges, the places where change would produce the clearest visible benefits, where the people who were resistant to change could observe the results and make their own assessments. He started with the workforce because workers who were treated fairly were the most immediate and obvious indicator that something was different. Better wages, enforced payment schedules, basic protections against the most abusive practices that had been standard under Gallywix. These changes were immediate and visible and produced exactly the effect that Gazlowe's theory predicted. The goblins at the productive base of the cartel responded with increased output and decreased turnover. This gave him a commercial argument. The workforce changes made the cartel more productive and reduced the costs associated with constantly replacing workers who left, trained replacements, and watched them leave for the same reasons. The productivity gains were measurable. He measured them. He presented the numbers to the skeptical middle management and said, "This is what treating people fairly costs, and this is what it produces, and the second number is larger than the first. Please update your models accordingly." Gazlowe took the position seriously in the way he took all his positions seriously, which is to say he treated it as a job to be done, rather than an elevation to be celebrated. The trade prince of the Bilgewater Cartel had specific responsibilities: managing the cartel's commercial operations, representing goblin interests within the Horde's political structure, and providing the Horde with the engineering and logistical capabilities that the goblins' technical tradition made possible. He did all of these things. He also started the harder work of trying to actually reform what the Bilgewater Cartel was, not just to run it better than Gallywix had run it, but to make it something genuinely different. A commercial organization that operated on honest principles. A goblin institution that produced value rather than primarily extracting it. This was ambitious. Goblin cultural values are not easily redirected, and the cartel system is deeply ingrained in how goblins understand themselves and their place in the world. The people who worked for the Bilgewater Cartel had spent their careers in an institution that rewarded extraction and punished naivete. Telling them that things were going to be different required more than an announcement. It required consistent demonstration over time that the new approach worked, that being fair and building genuine value was actually a viable commercial strategy, not just a nice idea. Gazlowe started demonstrating. On the Horde Council, Gazlowe represents something specific and important, the voice of practical competence in a council dominated by figures who are primarily warriors, political leaders, or spiritual authorities. The Horde Council as constituted includes Bane Bloodhoof for the Tauren, a representative of the Darkspear Trolls, Lorthamer Theron for the Blood Elves, a representative of the Forsaken, and figures from the other Horde races. Each brings their people's particular values and needs to the collective decision-making process. Gazlowe brings the goblins, which means he brings a set of concerns that are different in character from military honor or spiritual authority or territorial sovereignty. The council table is, in the lore's representation of it, a literal round table, an architectural choice that is deliberate and symbolic. No head of the table means no seat of special authority. Everyone at the table is, by the table's design, equal in standing. In practice, of course, the actual dynamics of any group of people with different levels of experience, different political resources, and different personal authority will produce hierarchies regardless of what shape the table is. The Blood Elves have more leverage than the Goblins by almost any measure of conventional political power. Bane Bloodhoof carries the moral weight of the Tauren tradition and Cairn's legacy. The Forsaken representative speaks for a people whose existence is already a demonstration of what the Horde is willing to accommodate. Gazlowe knows all of this. He does not pretend that the round table makes everyone equal in practice. What he insists on is that everyone's voice is heard, including his own, and that the decisions made at that table are actually implemented by people who have the engineering and logistical capacity to implement them. He is, at the council, something like the reality check, the figure who responds to ambitious, strategic proposals with, yes, and here is what it will cost, and here is when it could be ready, and here is what we cannot do at the same time, because the resources only go so far. He brings questions about how things actually work, about what the Horde's initiatives cost to implement, about whether the plans being made have been thought through in terms of logistics and resources and the practical requirements of execution, about whether there is a way to accomplish the same goal more efficiently or more cheaply or with less collateral damage to the people who are going to have to live with the consequences of the decision. These are not glamorous contributions. They are not the kind of thing that gets carved into stone as great historical pronouncements. But they are exactly the kind of contributions that determine whether a plan actually works or whether it collapses between the vision and the execution. His relationship with Bane Bloodhoof at the council table is one of genuine mutual respect, despite the fact that they approach their council roles from very different perspectives. Bane is a leader in the tradition of Tauren leadership, deliberate, spiritual, concerned with the honor and moral weight of decisions in ways that Gazlowe, the commercial pragmatist, does not typically foreground. But both of them lost something in the Garrosh era, and both of them want the council to be something real rather than a ceremonial structure that legitimizes decisions already made by more powerful parties. This shared purpose creates a working alliance between them. Lorthamer Theron is a more complicated relationship. The Blood Elves have always been the most politically sophisticated of the Horde's member races, the ones with the most experience navigating complex institutional environments, the most developed sense of their own leverage, the most elaborate set of contingency plans for any given situation. Lorthamer is intelligent and flexible and genuinely committed to the Blood Elves' interests in ways that Gazlowe respects. What Gazlowe is less certain about is whether Lorthamar's commitment extends to the Horde as an institution rather than to the Horde as it happens to be useful to the Blood Elves at any particular moment. They work together effectively. They are not entirely sure of each other. The Darkspear Troll representative brings Vol'jin's legacy to the table, and this is where Gazlowe's historical position in the Horde becomes most directly relevant. He knew Vol'jin. Not intimately, not in the way that Thrall knew him, but as someone he had worked alongside and respected and watched choose, repeatedly, to do the harder and more honorable thing. Vol'jin's selection as Warchief had felt right to Gazlowe, not because of troll-orc political calculations, but because Vol'jin was the kind of leader who had earned the position through the consistency of his choices. His representative at the council carries that weight, and Gazlowe treats it accordingly. His presence on the Horde Council also represents a shift in how the Horde conceptualizes its own membership. The Goblin experience in the Horde has been characterized by mixed treatment, welcomed for their engineering skills and commercial networks, sometimes patronized as a mercenary element rather than full members, subjected to leadership that did not prioritize their actual welfare. Gazlowe on the council is a goblin who insists on being taken seriously, whose advice is drawn from genuine competence rather than purchased with commercial leverage, who participates in the Horde's governance as a full member rather than a useful auxiliary. He does not need anyone to pretend that goblins are something they are not. He does not ask for special consideration or idealized treatment. He asks to be listened to when he says something is going to cost too much or take too long or fall down. And increasingly, across the Shadowlands era and into what followed, the Horde Council did listen. The Shadowlands expansion itself, the journey into the realm of the dead, the revelations about the jailer's corruption of the afterlife's structure, the confrontation with Sylvanas' choices and their cosmic consequences, is not primarily a Gazlowe story. His role in the expansion is at the Horde Council level, part of the governing body trying to manage the Horde's operations, while its most active members are off dealing with the end of the afterlife. But the Shadowlands era matters for Gazlowe's story, because it is when his new position and new responsibilities began to take concrete shape. He was new to the trade prince role, new to the council, navigating the transition from being a contractor for hire to being an actual political leader with real authority and real accountability. The expansion gave him time to settle into that role without immediately throwing him into a world-ending crisis that required every Horde leader to be a hero in some specific dramatic way. He managed logistics. He coordinated the Horde's engineering capabilities during the various Shadowlands crises. He maintained the communication between the Council and the forces operating in the Shadowlands. He kept things running on the Azeroth side, while the people who were equipped to deal with cosmic afterlife crises dealt with them. This is, in some ways, the most Gazlowe thing possible. The world literally died and needed saving, and Gazlowe's contribution was making sure the supply lines didn't fail and the council stayed functional. Not because he couldn't have gone to the Shadowlands, because someone needed to be the person who made sure everything worked while everyone else was busy saving existence. The specific logistical challenges of the Shadowlands era were genuinely novel. The creation of the Gate to the Shadowlands and the ongoing military and diplomatic operations that required regular traffic between Azeroth and the realm of the dead created infrastructure requirements that had never existed before. How do you supply a force operating in a reality that functions on completely different rules from the one your supply chain was built for? How do you maintain communication with people who are in a realm where normal communication methods simply do not reach? How do you manage the morale and operational effectiveness of forces that are fighting in conditions that include the psychological weight of being, literally, among the dead? These were not problems that had engineering solutions in the conventional sense, but they had solutions of a kind, and finding those solutions required someone with Gazlowe's particular combination of practical problem solving and institutional improvisation. He was, by this point in his career, an extremely experienced improviser, someone who had spent decades encountering situations for which no plan existed and building plans from the materials at hand. His efficiency during this period, the reliability with which the Horde's practical operations continued to function despite the massive disruption of the Shadowlands storyline, reinforced his credibility on the Council. He had proven, across years of the most chaotic circumstances Azeroth had managed to produce, that he could be trusted to deliver what he promised, on time, within reasonable cost, without requiring additional supervision. The Dragonflight expansion and the developments that followed, the return of the dragon aspects to their full power, the renewed connection between Azeroth's peoples and the Dragonflights, the political stabilization of a world that had been in continuous crisis for years, created an environment in which Gazlowe's longer-term project of reforming the Bilgewater Cartel could begin to bear visible fruit. The Goblin's engineering tradition is extraordinary. Goblin technology is frequently portrayed in Warcraft as chaotic and unreliable, the running joke about goblin rockets and explosives that fail spectacularly at inopportune moments. But this portrait is incomplete. Goblin engineering at its best produces solutions that other engineering traditions cannot match. Compact, powerful, highly adaptable to unusual situations, capable of being manufactured and deployed quickly in conditions where more conventional engineering would take far longer. The running joke about goblin explosives is not untrue. There is a genuine tendency in goblin engineering toward designing for maximum output with insufficient attention to reliability and safety margins. This tendency is partly cultural and partly commercial. Goblins historically valued dramatic demonstrations of capability because dramatic demonstrations sold products, and reliability was a less visible quality than spectacle. A rocket that launches impressively and lands unpredictably is more memorable in a sales presentation than a rocket that launches moderately and lands precisely. Gazlowe had always found this tendency irritating. His view of engineering was that the primary metric was whether the device did what it was supposed to do reliably, under conditions that included the realistic range of operator error and environmental variation. He had designed rocket systems. He had designed explosive compounds. His versions of these things worked correctly more often than the cartel standard, at the cost of being slightly less spectacular when they did work and significantly less spectacular when they failed. They failed quietly, rather than catastrophically, which was, he argued persistently, the correct failure mode. Under Gallywix, this philosophy was the engineering tradition of one contractor among many. Under Gazlowe's trade princedom, it became the Bilgewater Cartel's standard. He revised the cartel's engineering specifications. He rewrote the quality assurance requirements. He created an internal review process for new designs that required demonstration of reliable operation before commercial deployment. This produced, over the first few years of his leadership, a measurable improvement in the cartel's engineering output quality, fewer explosions in the wrong place, more explosions in the right place, and a significant reduction in the liability costs that had been a recurring drain on cartel finances under the old approach. Under Gallywix, this tradition was deployed primarily in service of Bilgewater commercial interests and whatever Horde military projects could be extracted for political advantage. The cartel's engineering capabilities were real, but they were oriented toward extraction and leverage rather than toward building durable value. Under Gazlowe, the question shifted. Not just what can we extract from this capability, but what can we build? The goblin engineering tradition, properly directed, was a genuine asset not just to the Bilgewater Cartel, but to the Horde and to Azeroth more broadly. The question was whether it could be directed, whether an institution as thoroughly shaped by extractive values as the Bilgewater Cartel could be redirected towards something more generative. He started small, pricing reforms within the cartel, ensuring that the workers who actually built and maintained the cartel's engineering projects received a fair share of what those projects produced, rather than having their earnings extracted upward to benefit leadership. Contracting reforms, transparent terms, enforceable agreements, consequences for breach that applied equally to the cartel and to its partners, rather than being structured to benefit the cartel regardless of performance. Governance changes, requiring that decisions with major impacts on cartel members be made with input from those members rather than being imposed from above. These are not dramatic revolutionary measures. They are the kinds of institutional reforms that sound obvious from the outside and are genuinely difficult from the inside, because every element of an institution built around a particular logic tends to resist changes that challenge that logic, even when the changes are improvements. The goblins who had spent their careers navigating the old system, who had learned to survive within it, who had developed skills specifically suited to its dynamics, did not all welcome the changes immediately. Some did. Many of those were the goblins who had been ground down most thoroughly by the old system, the workers rather than the managers, the engineers rather than the executives. And for them, reforms that meant they got paid fairly and treated decently were obviously welcome. Others took longer. The members of the cartel's middle management, goblins whose position depended on the old dynamics, who had accumulated leverage through methods that the new system was making less effective, required more time and more demonstration before they were convinced that the new approach was viable. Gazlowe's response to resistance was characteristically practical. He did not argue. He showed results. When a project conducted under the new terms worked, when the engineering was done on time and on budget, and the workers were paid fairly, and the client was satisfied, and the cartel made a reasonable profit, he pointed to it. When the old approach failed in predictable ways, he mentioned that he had said it would. He let the evidence do the persuasion that ideology could not. What makes Gazlowe's story compelling over its full arc is not any single dramatic moment. There are dramatic moments, the construction of a nation in a desert, the building of a garrison in an alternate timeline, the assumption of political leadership at a moment of institutional crisis. But the story's coherence comes from something quieter, the consistency of his values across circumstances that would have been quite sufficient justification for abandoning them. He grew up in a system that operated on extraction. He could have embraced that system. He was smart enough to have been very good at it on its own terms. He chose instead to build something different in Ratchet, a neutral port that actually was neutral, that actually was fair, that actually served its customers rather than exploiting them. He chose to bring that approach to Orgrimmar, to the Garrison, to the Bilgewater Cartel. The choices were not costless. Being fair when your competitors are not costs you the advantage that unfairness provides. Charging honest prices means you leave money on the table that someone willing to gouge could have taken. Treating your workers fairly means your labor costs are higher than someone willing to exploit them. Gazlowe has always known this. He has never pretended that his approach was the path of least resistance within the context of goblin commercial culture. He made the argument, consistently and by example, rather than by proclamation, that it was the better approach in the long run, that the reputation for fairness brought clients that dishonest competitors could not keep, that workers who were treated decently were more productive and more loyal than workers who had to spend their energy protecting themselves from their employer, that institutions built on extraction eventually hollowed themselves out, while institutions built on genuine value creation could last. This is not a particularly exotic argument. In many commercial traditions, it would be considered obvious. In goblin culture, it was genuinely radical. Gazlowe spent his career making the case. His relationship with specific individuals across the decades tells the story of his broader values in personal terms. Thrall is the most significant of these relationships. The partnership that began during the Third War, when Gazlowe brought his engineering expertise to the construction of Durotar, continued through the events of multiple expansions. Their relationship is not one of equals in formal terms. Thrall was the war chief, then the world shaman, then a returned elder statesman, while Gazlowe was always an engineer and commercial operator. But in terms of mutual respect and genuine understanding, they have consistently treated each other as colleagues. The early years of their collaboration during the Durotar construction phase established a dynamic that neither had explicitly designed, but that suited both of them. Thrall had a tendency in those years to carry the weight of everything. The entire fate of the Orcish people, the legacy of the corruption, the question of whether the new horde could survive and become what he hoped it could become. It was a weight that showed on him in the way large responsibilities show on people who take them seriously, and it occasionally made his dealings with subordinates and collaborators more formal and more burdened than the situation strictly required. Gazlowe did not relate to Thrall as though the weight were there. He related to Thrall as the client for a series of construction projects with the directness and practical focus that defined all his client relationships. This was not disrespect. It was the goblin version of treating someone normally, which required not treating them as though their status required special management. In a leadership environment that included a lot of careful management of Thrall's status, Gazlowe's straightforwardness was, it turned out, exactly what Thrall needed some of the time. Thrall has never been condescending about Gazlowe's commercial nature. He does not idealize goblins or pretend that their commercial orientation is something other than what it is. He dealt with enough goblins in building Orgrimmar to understand exactly how goblin economics work. But he also recognized early that Gazlowe was operating by a different set of values than the goblin norm, and he valued that difference appropriately. Gazlowe has never needed Thrall's approval to know that he is doing things right. His confidence in his own judgment is comprehensive and well-founded. Decades of successfully building things that work in adverse conditions does that. But he values Thrall's opinion as he values the opinion of anyone whose judgment he respects, which is to say genuinely and without performance. The various war chiefs who came between Thrall's first tenure and the Council era are a more complicated set of relationships. Garrosh Hellscream, with his specific brand of Orcish supremacism and his aggressive dismissal of non-Orcish contributions to the Horde, was not someone who naturally valued what Gazlowe had to offer. The engineering work was valued as instrumental. Gazlowe himself, as a goblin with his own commercial interests and his own principles, was tolerated rather than respected. He continued to do the work regardless, because the Horde needed what he could provide. Vol'jin's brief warchief tenure is one of the periods that Gazlowe reflects on with what appears to be genuine sadness. Vol'jin was a leader who understood what the Horde was supposed to be and had spent decades in the Coalition working toward it, including the years when Garrosh made that work feel nearly pointless. He had a quality that was relatively rare in Horde leadership. He was genuinely interested in the perspectives of people who were not like him. He asked Gazlowe questions about goblin culture and goblin engineering and what the goblins in the Horde wanted from the Coalition that they could not get elsewhere. He listened to the answers. He incorporated them into how he thought about the Horde's governance. This was, in Gazlowe's experience, unusual behavior in a war chief, and he had valued it accordingly. Sylvanas Windrunner presented a different challenge. Her agenda, as it gradually became clear, was not aligned with the Horde's interests in any straightforward sense. It was aligned with her own project, which turned out to be cosmic in scope and utterly unconcerned with the welfare of the people she nominally led. Gazlowe's response to Sylvanas throughout her warchief period was watchful rather than confrontational. He did not trust her based on everything he could observe about how she made decisions, but he did not have the basis for direct opposition until her behavior made opposition clearly necessary. When that threshold was crossed, when it became clear that Sylvanas was not making decisions in the Horde's interest, Gazlowe was among those who moved toward the political solution that produced the Horde Council. The Council itself was, in a sense, an engineering solution to a political problem. Identify the failure mode, single point of authority that can be corrupted or captured. Redesign the system to eliminate or mitigate that failure mode. Distribute authority across multiple representatives who check each other. test the result against reality. He would put it more practically than that. But the logic is the same. Marin Noggenfogger, his old roommate from the Undermine Commerce College, the goblin he had left Undermine alongside, appears periodically in Warcraft history as an illustration of a different path through goblin culture. Marin ended up in Tanaris, running the trading settlement of Gajetsun from the Noggenfogger family's base, becoming famous across the world for Noggenfogger Elixir, a product whose main claim to fame is that it does unpredictable and often humorous things to whoever drinks it at a time when exactly what it would do is unknown. The elixir is, in some ways, the perfect goblin product. It is inexpensive to produce. It generates repeat business because people want to find out what happens next. And the unpredictability is a feature in the marketing narrative, even as it would be a defect in any conventional engineering context. Marin and Gazlowe have maintained their friendship across the decades in the casual way that old friends do when their lives have taken them in completely different directions. They see each other occasionally. They know each other well enough to skip the reestablishment of context that new acquaintances require. They appreciate each other without needing to pretend that their choices have been identical. Marin has never judged Gazlowe for the political complications of his Horde involvement. Gazlowe has never judged Marin for building a personal commercial empire rather than an institution. Marin is a successful goblin by conventional goblin standards. He has built something. He has made money. He has achieved commercial prominence. He is also, by most indicators, a fairly honest businessman in the context of his market, the strange and competitive world of Tanaris trading, with its particular mix of adventurer clientele and desert commerce. He represents a version of goblin entrepreneurship that is recognizable and fairly benign. But he never took on the kind of institutional responsibility that Gazlowe took on. His ambitions were commercial and personal rather than civic. He built a business rather than a port that other people's livelihoods depended on. He got rich rather than getting involved. This is a legitimate choice. Most people make it. It is easier, and the costs of the alternatives are real. Gazlowe's path was harder. It produced something rarer. The relationship between the two old friends is, in the lore, friendly. They know each other well and seem genuinely fond of each other. But they represent different answers to the question of what you do with the intelligence and the ambition that goblin culture and kaja'mite produces. This is not meant to diminish Marin. He is good at what he does, and what he does is genuinely valuable. But the contrast illuminates what is specific about Gazlowe's choice, the choice to take responsibility for something larger than himself, repeatedly, across decades, when he could have taken the easier road. His approach to engineering itself reflects his broader values in ways that are worth spelling out directly. Engineering, real engineering, the kind that produces things that work rather than things that look impressive, requires honesty. You cannot lie to a structure. If a foundation is insufficient for the load it has to carry, the building falls down. If a mechanism has more friction than the driving force can overcome, it stops working. If a design does not account for the actual conditions in which it will operate, the wind loads, the temperature variations, the quality of the available materials, the skill level of the workers who will build and maintain it fails in exactly the ways that it was designed to fail. Engineering is therefore, in a fundamental way, a discipline of reality. The best engineers are the ones who see reality most clearly and whose designs are most fully responsive to what reality actually demands rather than what the engineer or the client would prefer it to demand. Gazlowe is this kind of engineer. He is not interested in designs that will impress clients if they are not going to work. He is not interested in promising timelines that cannot be met or budgets that cannot be maintained. He will tell you that the thing you want cannot be built in the time you have given him, and he will tell you why, and he will tell you what could be built instead and when it could be ready. This directness is, in the context of goblin commercial culture, somewhat unusual. The conventional goblin approach to a client who wants the impossible is to promise the impossible, take the money, and then renegotiate when the impossibility becomes apparent. This generates short-term gain and long-term reputation damage. Gazlowe observed this pattern in Undermine, observed its consequences, and decided to operate differently. The result is that his reputation for honesty about what he can deliver is one of the most valuable things he owns. Clients who have worked with Gazlowe know that if he says something will be done by a certain time, at a certain cost, to a certain specification, those things will be true. This makes him the engineer of choice for projects where the consequences of failure are unacceptable, which in Azeroth tends to mean projects with military or political consequences. You do not want the walls of a city under siege to fall down, because your engineer was not honest about the quality of the stone. He has a particular way of communicating the technical limitations of a project to non-technical clients that is worth noting, because it is not as common a skill as engineers tend to assume. Most engineers, faced with a client who wants something impossible, either capitulate and promise the impossible or explain the impossibility in technical language that the client does not fully understand and which the client therefore dismisses as excessive caution. Gazlowe does neither. He translates. He takes the technical reality and expresses it in terms of consequences that the client actually cares about, in language that the client actually uses. When Thrall wanted Orgrimmar's outer walls extended in a direction that would have undermined the foundation of the existing structure, Gazlowe did not say, "The lateral load redistribution at the junction point will create a shear stress in the existing foundation that exceeds the structural tolerance of the local stone." He said, "I can extend the walls that direction, but in about 6 months, the section where the new wall meets the old one is going to crack, and when it cracks, it will be during a siege, and your people will be standing on that section. Do you want to know what I can do instead?" Thrall wanted to know what he could do instead. The same directness applies to his political role on the Horde Council. He tells the council what he actually thinks, including when what he thinks is inconvenient. He does not tell people what they want to hear. He tells them what they need to know. In a political body populated by figures with large egos and strong convictions and complicated agendas, this makes him simultaneously annoying and indispensable. No one loves being told their plan has a fatal flaw. Everyone needs to hear it before they find out from the plan's failure. The question of goblin heritage and the kaja'mite problem is something that Gazlowe's career touches on without fully resolving, and it is worth addressing directly because it is central to goblin lore. The kaja'mite that enhanced goblin intelligence was finite. The mines of Kazan that produced it are the source of the goblin civilization's intellectual capacity, and when the mines were exhausted, gradually over centuries of intensive extraction, the cognitive enhancement they had provided began to attenuate. Goblins who were exposed to kaja'mite from birth, as the pre-modern generations were, benefited from sustained exposure during their formative years. Goblins born in later eras, when the kaja'mite supply had been reduced to a fraction of its historical levels, may have experienced diminished cognitive baseline as a result. The extent to which this diminishment was already occurring before Kazan's destruction is a topic that goblin scholars have not historically been enthusiastic about investigating publicly, for the obvious reason that the commercial and political implications of demonstrating a decline in goblin cognitive capability are extremely uncomfortable for everyone in the cartel system. A civilization whose competitive advantage is built on intelligence does not benefit commercially from acknowledging that its intelligence may be declining. The studies were done, the results were suppressed. The institutions that funded the studies made sure the researchers understood what the correct interpretation of the data was. The Isle of Kazan's destruction during the Cataclysm destroyed what remained of the kaja'mite deposits. This is a loss that affects not just current goblins, but all future generations of goblin civilization, a permanent reduction in the raw intellectual capacity that the goblin species had relied on for thousands of years. Gazlowe was old enough at the time of Kazan's destruction that his own formative development had occurred when kaja'mite exposure was still significant. His intelligence is not in question and was not affected by the loss, but the trajectory of goblin civilization going forward, the question of what goblins can be in a world without the mineral that made them what they are, is something that his leadership of the Bilgewater Cartel will inevitably have to address. The honest version of addressing this question is uncomfortable. Goblin civilization was built on an enhancement that is no longer available, and the question of what goblin civilization can be without that enhancement is genuinely open. The goblins who live now and who will live in the coming generations will not have the baseline cognitive advantage that their ancestors had. They will be intelligent. Goblin intellectual culture, the accumulated knowledge and the engineering tradition and the commercial acumen that thousands of years of kaja'mite-enhanced thinking produced, is a genuine inheritance that does not disappear with the mineral. But the edge, the particular sharpness that made goblin engineers and goblin traders the most technically capable people in any room, that may dull over generations. Gazlowe has thought about this. He thinks about it in the way that practical people think about problems they cannot solve directly. You address the constraints you can address, and you work to preserve what can be preserved. He has prioritized education within the Bilgewater Cartel in ways that Gallywix never did. Investing in the technical training of young goblins, creating apprenticeship programs that connect the most experienced engineers in the cartel with the next generation, building libraries and documentation practices that ensure the knowledge accumulated by the kaja'mite-enhanced generations is not lost when those generations are gone. He has not resolved this problem. It may not be resolvable in a straightforward sense. What can be done is to ensure that the intellectual tradition produced by thousands of years of kaja'mite enhanced goblin thinking is preserved and cultivated and passed forward, that the engineering knowledge, the commercial acumen, the problem-solving approaches that define goblin intellectual culture continue to be taught and practiced and developed, even as the biochemical foundation that originally produced them is no longer available. There is something in this that Gazlowe finds, if not comforting, then at least familiar. He has spent his career building institutions that outlast the immediate circumstances of their creation. Ratchet will exist when Gazlowe is gone. Orgrimmar will exist when he is gone. The reformed Bilgewater Cartel, if the reforms take, if what he is building has sufficient structural integrity to outlast his own tenure, will be a different institution than the one he inherited. Whether goblins are less cognitively enhanced in 200 years than they are now, the tradition he is working to preserve and strengthen will still be there for them to draw on. This is, in a way, the deepest version of what Gazlowe has been doing his whole career, working to preserve and build on the genuine value in goblin culture while stripping away the extractive dynamics that corrupt it. The intellectual tradition is the genuine value. The cartel system's extractive orientation is the corruption. Separating one from the other, building institutions that cultivate the former without requiring the latter, is the work. He will not finish it in his lifetime. It is not the kind of work that finishes in a lifetime. It is the kind that gets handed forward, incrementally improved to whoever comes next. In terms of the physical presence that Gazlowe projects, the specific, recognizable character of the goblin who has been in Azeroth since the Third War and shows no signs of stopping, there is something worth noting about how he carries the years. He has not changed dramatically in the ways that dramatic characters change. He has not been transformed by cosmic power, or crushed by tragedy, or rebuilt by redemption. He is, in the most important sense, recognizably the same person he was when he showed up in Ratchet with a plan and a Steamweedle cartel charter and a refusal to go back to Undermine. He is shorter than almost everyone he works with. He is greener than most of them. His ears are longer. His nose is larger. His voice is characteristically goblin, quick, confident, with a commercial patter, underlying even casual conversation. He is not physically imposing. He has never been physically imposing. He does not need to be physically imposing. What he projects is competence, and in Azeroth, competence is its own kind of authority. He wears engineer's clothes, practical, durable, often stained with whatever he was last working on. He carries his tools as a matter of course. He is not a warrior and does not pretend to be one, though he can defend himself when necessary and has been in enough dangerous situations to have developed reflexes for recognizing when defense is about to become necessary. He has been in siege conditions. He has been in combat. He has constructed weapons for other people to use, while he was focused on the construction problem and the weapon was being fired at him. He has developed, over decades of this, a working relationship with danger that is not reckless and not cowardly, just practical. Danger is a constraint you work within. You acknowledge it, you account for it in your plan, and you build your way out of it. The humor is a consistent element of how he occupies a room. He makes observations rather than jokes. The distinction being that jokes are designed to be funny in isolation, while observations are things that are true and also happen to be amusing. The best Gazlowe lines are the ones that make you laugh and then make you realize he was also accurately describing the situation. When he noted, during the Frostwall Garrison construction, that the cold was going to kill more of his peons than the Iron Horde was, it was a joke. It was also an assessment of the actual operational risk profile of the project that turned out to be correct. He is also, and this is worth saying plainly, because it is sometimes obscured by the commercial framing of his character, genuinely warm. He likes people, he is interested in them, in what they are trying to do, what they need, what problems they are trying to solve. His humor comes from this interest. The jokes are observations, drawn from actually paying attention to the world and the people in it, rather than performances designed to manage how he is perceived. This warmth is not unconditional. He does not like people who exploit the vulnerable. He does not like people who lie about what they can deliver and then blame the failure on circumstances. He does not like people who treat the goblins who work for them as resources to be extracted rather than people to be employed. These antipathies are as genuine and consistent as his warmth, and they inform every professional and political relationship he maintains. If you ask him about Gallywix, which people occasionally do, he gives you a practical assessment rather than a moral denunciation. He does not waste energy on denunciation. He describes what Gallywix did in commercial terms, the decisions he made, the outcomes they produced, the structural damage to the Bilgewater Cartel that his tenure created, and he draws the commercial conclusion: it was a bad investment. The evacuation scheme maximized short-term extraction at the cost of catastrophic long-term trust damage. The exploitation of the Lost Isles survivors destroyed the kind of loyalty that makes commercial operations durable. The corruption of the Bilgewater's engineering output under Gallywix's indifference to quality standards cost the cartel clients it will take years to rebuild. All of this is true and is presented as fact because it is fact. The moral dimension is present in the facts if you are paying attention. Gazlowe does not feel the need to highlight it separately. He is an engineer. He trusts the structure to speak for itself. The arc of Gazlowe's story, from Undermine to Ratchet to Orgrimmar to Frostwall to the Horde Council, describes something that Warcraft does not often make central: the story of institution building. Not the founding of a nation through conquest, not the creation of a religion through divine revelation, not the establishment of an order through training and initiation. The story of one person with specific skills and specific values consistently choosing to build things that last and make the world work slightly better than it would have otherwise. He built Ratchet, not just the physical structures, the docks and warehouses and market facilities, but the institution, the neutral port, the fair dealing, the reputation for honest transactions in a commercial environment where honest transactions were not the default. That institution has survived multiple world-altering catastrophes because it provides genuine value and because the people who have come to depend on it understand that its value depends on its integrity. Ratchet was not simply a collection of buildings. It was a demonstration, running continuously for decades, that a goblin institution could operate on honest principles and remain commercially viable. Every year it continued to operate was another data point in that demonstration. He built Orgrimmar, or the parts of it that required the kind of engineering creativity that the city's initial construction demanded. The city is not his in any proprietary sense. It belongs to the Horde, but his hand is in its structure, in the decisions that made it defensible and livable and capable of becoming what it has become. The walls that have withstood decades of assault, the rope bridges that have become one of the city's most recognizable features, the foundational engineering choices that made the city grow in the directions it needed to grow. These reflect decisions Gazlowe made in the earliest phase of the Horde's settlement, decisions that turned out to be right. He built the garrison at Frostwall and the various other installations that his skills were brought to bear on across the expansion cycles of Warcraft's history. Each of these was a specific engineering challenge in a specific environment solved through application of knowledge, experience, and the willingness to acknowledge when the first approach is not working and try something different. And now he is building something harder than any physical structure, an institution of governance, both within the Bilgewater Cartel and on the Horde Council, that operates on principles different from the ones that goblin culture has traditionally endorsed. An institution that might, over time, demonstrate that honest dealing and genuine value creation are viable alternatives to the extractive model that goblin civilization has been built on for thousands of years. The goblin culture he is trying to reform is not, at its root, incompatible with what he is building. The cartel system's extractive orientation is a choice that was made, generation by generation, in response to the particular incentives of goblin society's structure. It is not a biological inevitability. It is not inscribed in the species at a level that cannot be reached by other choices. What Gazlowe is demonstrating through the Bilgewater Cartel's operation under his leadership is that a different choice is possible, that goblin culture's intelligence and commercial skill and engineering genius can be deployed in service of genuine value creation rather than extraction, and that this deployment produces better outcomes for the goblins involved, not just morally, but commercially. He will not live to see whether it works in the long run. Neither will anyone alive today. This is the nature of institutional reform. Its effects are measured in generations, not in fiscal years. But he will keep working at it. He will keep showing up. He will keep building things that hold, charging fair prices for the work, telling people what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear, and making the argument by example that a goblin can be both successful and decent without these two things being in contradiction. He will keep being Gazlowe. The world of Azeroth produces, with some regularity, figures of cosmic significance, beings who shape the fate of planets, who wield powers that would have seemed divine to earlier ages of the world, who live and die at scales of consequence that defy ordinary comprehension. These figures dominate the narratives. They are the ones whose stories get told around campfires and in great halls, whose actions are carved into commemorative stones and immortalized in oral tradition. Gazlowe is not one of them. He never will be. He is a goblin engineer from Undermine who built a port town and then a city and then a military base and then a reformed institution, one project at a time, one deal at a time, one day of showing up at a time. But Azeroth could not have become what it is without people like him. The great figures, Thrall, Jaina, Sylvanas, the Aspects, the champions whose names are known across continents, operate in a world whose infrastructure exists because someone built it. Someone dug the foundations of Orgrimmar and poured the concrete of its walls. Someone designed the docks that allow trade across the vast stretches of ocean that separate Azeroth's continents. Someone figured out how to build a viable military installation in an alternate timeline's frozen volcanic highland. That someone was, in enough of the cases that matter, Gazlowe. His story is a story about what it means to be useful, genuinely, practically, consistently useful, in a world that needs usefulness as desperately as it needs heroes. He is not a hero in the conventional sense. He is something rarer. A person who does the work, takes the money, keeps his word, builds things that hold, and tries, incrementally and with full awareness of the difficulty, to make the institutions he is part of a little more honest than he found them. He would probably tell you this description is too grand. He would probably make a joke about the profit margins of moral philosophy. He would probably then go back to whatever he was building. That is the complete story of Gazlowe. If you found his life as compelling as I do, the story of the goblin who built things worth keeping in a world that is constantly trying to knock them down, please leave a like and subscribe, because we have the full stories of all of Warcraft's most fascinating characters waiting for you right here on World of Sleepcraft.